If she closed her eyes, it almost felt like they weren't moving at all, Julia thought, but couldn't bring herself to show a smile. The 4 people in this small shuttle had drawn the short straws, after all. They had been chosen to lead the advance after the dead ship had been spotted almost an Earth standard week ago. It was close to half the size of their own vessel, the Artemis, so it still was considered a big ship, even though not a single one of their attempts at contact had gotten a response. Their sensors had scanned that vessel, flying aimlessly through space over 100 times, but had found no sign of life, at least not close to the outer hull of the ship. Even sensors had a limited range, after all. That was why they were now in here, in this transport shuttle silently drifting toward the giant, dead behemoth. As long as the damage to this thing wasn't catastrophic, the docks should still work at least. Julia looked over and could see Arthur fiddling around with what was essentially a giant bag. There was this smile on his face that she didn't like very much.
It's the law of finders keepers,
he replied to the question she hadn't asked, and his smile got even wider.
It's not like we're on some kind of humanitarian mission. If they send us over, just the 4 of us, we should at least get something for our troubles, don't you think?
Julia sighed. It wasn't like she could really refute him, after all. The SEOs wouldn't mind them lifting some souvenirs, so as long as it wasn't mission critical or dangerous, they could pretty much take their picks first. But the bag the man was holding was just obscene. If he filled it up, he would look like one of those old depictions of Santa. The people back on the Artemis would lose their minds if he came in carrying his body weight in stolen loot. But that was a discussion for later. Right now, she needed to make sure they all at least kept to their roles. Arthur, who was one of the comms people on the Artemis, would at least do his job if she told him to. But the other 2 were more complicated. She looked over at Samson, who was a security officer, still checking his equipment. For missions such as this, he was permitted to bring the lethal rounds in his gun, as well as his normal weapons like the stun baton and 2 flashbangs. He looked far happier than she had ever seen, Julia thought, and felt a shiver run through her bones. That smile on his lips was probably how some people would look at their children, not their guns. She didn't like it. It creeped her out. Then again, it was still better than Christy, who was sitting next to her. That woman didn't smile. Never had, never would. Her whole demeanor was so standoffish. The other people working with her had given her a whole range of nicknames none would dare repeat to her face. She was a psychopath, some had claimed, while others called her an android, cyborg, or even an alien sent to infiltrate their ranks. Julia knew better, of course. She had looked at those 3 people's files during the briefing before the mission started. Christy was just a screwed-up human who didn't fit in with the others in the lab. That was also why she had been chosen. Maybe they hoped that something would happen. Julia sighed inwardly, then shook her head. There were easier ways to rid oneself of unwanted shipmates. Things that wouldn't put others in danger. This mission here was just that, a mission. It might be an annoying one, or one that could get complicated, but they were in no danger of dying. At least as long as she was in charge. Julia looked down at a small watch-like screen on her wrist. ETA 2 Earth Standard Minutes.
Everyone, check your masks.
She let out and saw her crewmates grabbing their equipment from behind their seats. The sensors of the Artemis had shown some signs of oxygen still inside the vessel, but they couldn't very well rely on that. Even if worst came to worst and they found the ship completely dead and devoid of any air, they would still need to check out its condition, including the core. It was important to make sure this thing wouldn't simply blow up. Whether they decided to check it out in earnest or leave it be and continue their planned journey without a full investigation. Julia grabbed her own mask as well, put it on her face, and felt the seal snap shut the next moment. The tiny screen on her wrist was counting down the last seconds before they would reach their destination. Julia looked at the 3 people who would accompany her and gave them a nod. With a loud, echoing clang, the shuttle reached the big ship's hull before the magnetized struts powered up, anchoring it right on one of the smaller airlocks. Julia listened to the noises now moving through their transport shuttle. The hissing of the hydraulics, a membrane unfurling, then connecting them to the airlock. One loud beep as their shuttle began trying to start the handshake protocol with the foreign vessel. She looked down at a small screen on her wrist. Rows of text appeared. A problem with establishing the connection. No power in the outlet. Override. She heard the hiss and felt a vibration as their shuttle forcefully pried open the door, then finally gave her the okay to proceed. Julia stood up from her seat, felt the magnets in her shoes anchoring her to the floor, and gave the 3 others a sign to follow her lead. They were wearing their masks, their equipment had been checked, and they knew what to expect. It wouldn't get any better than this, she told herself. With a long sigh, she walked over to the door at the back of the shuttle, then pressed her ID against a scanner. It opened with a hiss, revealing the membrane protecting them from the cold vacuum of space. And just a few meters further in was the airlock of the big ship, looking like the gaping mouth of a giant creature. Julia pushed herself off the floor and started drifting toward it. Behind her, the 3 others would follow. They all knew the plan, so they should be able to do their work on their own, even if she had decided to stay back. But that just wasn't her style. And it wasn't her CO's either. If she finished this job perfectly, there might be a promotion in the near future, he had told her. Julia would make sure it all went to plan. Her feet reached the metal floor inside the airlock, and she felt the magnets in her shoes pulling her down in a soft landing. Ships that size normally had some kind of gravity generator in them, but apparently the power was completely out. That also meant no air generation, no light, and probably a whole host of stuck doors. This vessel was dead. Julia cursed inwardly, took a few steps, then felt and heard the 3 others landing in the airlock behind her. She turned on the flashlight mounted to her shoulder and bathed the small room in this eerie, almost sterile-looking white.
Let's get this door open,
Julia ordered, and watched Arthur walk past her with a small device already in hand. He would need to do that for every single door they would come across, Julia thought, and felt her hopes of a quick and easy finish to this assignment disappearing. As long as there was no power, there would be no access to the main computer either. They could temporarily supply a door with enough electricity to force it open, but there was no way in hell to create the amount of energy needed to power up the mainframe. Which meant they would have to walk around and collect evidence by hand. She watched Arthur work quickly and quietly, then turned around and saw the other 2 standing by. Samson had his baton in his hand and was looking around as if he were expecting something to pop out, while Christy seemed more bored and in her own thoughts than actually interested in what was going on. What a great team she had gotten! Julia wanted to complain, but kept her mouth shut in the end. With a hiss, the door opened, and Arthur gave her a quick nod. How long had it been? Almost 30 seconds, she guessed. If she timed that by 100 doors, that would come out to 50 Earth Standard minutes they would spend on waiting for stuff to open. And that was if everything worked perfectly. Their oxygen tanks would last a few hours, so they would need to see how far they could come in that time. If she got back without anything at all, her promotion would disappear, right? Julia walked past her colleague and looked into the dead and empty ship for the first time. A long, empty hallway stretched out behind the now open door. It looked darker than the room they were standing in. She could feel this prickly sensation in her neck as she took another step and pointed the flashlight on her shoulder down the hallway. It wasn't that her light was weakening or anything like that. The air inside the hallways just seemed strange somehow. Julia heard someone else taking a few steps, turned around, and watched Samson slightly shove his colleagues out of the way to follow her into the hallway. The expression on his face was one she really didn't like. He seemed tense, almost, but as soon as his flashlight reached the hallway, the interior started glowing just like the airlock they had come from. Julia shook her head, gave him a nod, and waited for the other two to follow them. Arthur had a smile on his face as he unplugged his device and walked out toward them, while Christy seemed to look around for a moment.
I don't think...
The bang that followed almost made Julia scream. Above them, the lamps began to flicker, but she had no time to look or think. Julia could see the membrane of their shuttle getting ripped to shreds as the whole ship shook violently, and then heard Christy crying out. A loud beep filled the air around them. She saw Arthur jumping forward, felt the air in the hallway suddenly rushing toward the airlock, then heard and saw the door closing down with a hiss and a bang. It all happened so fast. The last thing she had seen before the door had fallen shut had been Christy, stretching out her arms toward her. A curse reached her ears. She looked around and found the two people she had come with only staying on their feet because their shoes were still sticking to the floor. Above them, the lights went out again, and all she could hear was this eerie quiet.
What was that?
Her own voice sounded so shrill in her ears. The shuttle had been ripped away by force. How could something like that happen? And why had the power turned on for a moment? The airlock's shutdown had been triggered as well.
Did you activate some kind of failsafe?
Julia was grabbing Arthur by the shoulders, pushing his body backwards as far as she could. He had almost killed them all. Their suits were meant for exploration, not for the vacuum of space. A hand grabbed her by the shoulder and pushed her back, and as she looked up, she could see Samson, the security officer, standing there, shaking his head.
"Open the door again, Arthur,"
he just said, while keeping her away from him.
"Hurry."
Arthur shot her a last, wide-eyed glance, then turned and ran the 2 steps to the door. This time, there was no leisure in his movements. Julia noticed his shaking fingers and the pain and fear as he hammered commands into the device. Only a couple of seconds passed before a loud tone filled the air again. But this time, the door stayed shut.
It's locked! Completely locked down!
What do you mean?
Julia hissed back.
Just open the damn door.
The man looked back at her. His eyes were so wide she could almost feel his desperation.
It's an emergency protocol. There's no pressure behind the door. If we don't blast it open, it will stay shut.
Julia was shaking her head in disbelief. This wasn't about her promotion anymore. What had this idiot done to them? She wanted to grab him and force him to open the door. But before she could take another step, Samson got in front of her.
"That won't help anyone. If he's right, we won't get through this door anyway."
Julia shot the man an angry glance, then shook her head. He was right, she knew. But still, how could they have messed it all up this quickly? And what should they do now? She looked down at the small screen on her wrist. Normally, she would be able to send commands to the shuttle through it, but the connection had been severed as well. There was no way of contacting the main ship, no way to get their own vessel back. They would have to wait until the captain of the Artemis sent someone else to look for them. That could take hours. She glanced at the oxygen levels on the small screen. They still had enough for that, but the new shuttle wouldn't dock at the same airlock as they had. There was no way of knowing where they would land. Julia turned away and took a few steps. The air had moved when the shuttle had been lost. And the first time Arthur had opened the door, there hadn't been this kind of rush of air from their ship into the hallway. That meant there was air or some other gas in here, and that at a comparable level to what they had had in the shuttle. maybe they wouldn't need to wear the masks all the time. If they could breathe just fine. Julia stopped, then quickly turned around and froze. She was staring right into Samson's flashlight. Both their lights were meeting, and at the intersection, she noticed something. It looked almost like a shadow hanging in the air. Julia's eyes wandered from the strange phenomenon to Samson himself. There, on his suit, were small black streaks. She looked down at herself and noticed the same. Everywhere there was a crease, she could see this stuff. She wiped her finger across it and found it easily sticking to her glove.
What is it?
Samson asked, and she lifted her hand until his cone of light hit it directly. The black dust didn't glimmer, but seemed to dull as the flashlight illuminated it.
There's something in here.
She looked up and could see both of her crewmates now wiping the creases of their suits, then lifting their now dirty fingers in the air.
Is it Ash?
It was Arthur who had asked the question. Julia shook her head, then looked down the hallway again. That had been the reason why her flashlight had felt so dim at the start. This stuff was everywhere in the air, floating there in zero gravity. No, if this were ash, it would smear between her fingers, but those single grains or particles stayed intact, no matter how much pressure she exerted. Besides, a burn that released this much soot and ash would have ravaged the whole ship. Only, what was it then?
Everyone, keep your masks on until we've figured out what this stuff is.
Julia warned, then swiped her hand slowly through the air and captured more of those strange particles. She couldn't very well pull off her mask and try to smell it or taste it. They didn't even have anything they could test it with. Was it organic or just some dust? Would it be dangerous to inhale or inert? Could it irritate their skin, their eyes, their lungs? She didn't like it. With no one else around, they had no idea if it was dangerous or not. And right now, she couldn't risk losing another of her crewmates on this assignment.
We can't just sit around here. Let's continue on and wait for the Artemis to re-establish contact.
Julia said, and began walking down the empty hallway, while the other two followed her lead. While not as big as the Artemis, the ship they had boarded was still far too big for just the three of them to look through. It would take them days to check every room and level, and that was definitely more time than they had left. Exploration wasn't a top priority anymore anyway. If they could find a place where this black stuff hadn't reached, they could try and wait there, saving some of their oxygen until the next shuttle arrived. She would keep the other two alive, then find out what exactly had happened later. Did Christy have family on the Artemis? She couldn't remember. According to her dossier and personality, Julia doubted it, though.
And I told you it's just not possible.
She stopped her steps as she heard the angry voice behind her. Arthur was almost growling at Samson, who only looked at him like he was some kind of small and aggressive animal. She'd heard them talking before, but the sharpness of the tone now made her take notice.
I only powered up that single door. How can I trigger a shipwide emergency response from one door? All the lights turned on for a few seconds. Do you think that was me as well?
Julia watched as the security officer simply shook his head.
You must have done something. Activated something in the ship.
She could see how tense Arthur was. One of his hands was actually in a fist. Would he try to punch his colleague?
That's not how this works. You can't activate the main system by powering up a single door. The energy needed for that would be astronomical.
She had wanted to hit him before, but now Julia thought his words made sense. The lights had turned on, yes, and the shuttle had almost been blasted off the hull. Had the ship come to life on its own for a few seconds? If that was the case, they could maybe salvage this whole operation. She stepped between the two, more to protect Arthur than the security officer, and put a hand on his forearm.
So, what exactly did happen?
Julia felt a pang of guilt for not having asked the question sooner. That would be part of those leadership skills her superior had talked about. She felt Arthur stepping back from her, but at least he relaxed his hand.
I don't know. Something tripped the emergency response to pirates or the like boarding the ship, but it couldn't have been me. The ship just came to life again for a few seconds, blew off our shuttle, and closed the door down. There was nothing anyone could have done.
Julia looked at him very closely. He was panicked and grieving, but he didn't seem like he was just trying to shirk responsibility.
What could have done it then?
At the question, the man seemed to freeze. He stammered and shook his head.
I don't know. I really don't. The ship is dead. It should be dead. There's no air circulation, no light, no nothing. If the reactor had imploded or someone had turned it off, it wouldn't have come back to life, though. And if someone had turned it on, it would have stayed on as well. There's something wrong here.
Julia wiped a bit of the black dust off her shoulder, then nodded. This ship wasn't normal. She could feel it as well. Then, what had happened to it? Did it have something to do with the black dust? Julia looked over at Arthur, who was still standing by, waiting for them to continue. There really was no air circulation here, but that also meant that they might be able to quickly move down a few levels if they climbed into the vents. With no gravity either, the dangers of falling were mitigated as well.
Can you check the next air duct we find? I need to know if we can use it to get around the doors.
He nodded courtly, as he always did. Julia turned, patted Arthur on the shoulder, gave him a nod as well.
Sorry for back there. For what it's worth, I don't blame you.
She told him. Julia could see his brow furrow a bit, and the panicked expression softened. They didn't have to walk for long before Samson put a hand on her shoulder to stop her, then pointed to the side. There, close to the floor, in the wall, she could see one of those vents.
Go for it.
Julia told him, and looked down as the man turned and walked over at a quick pace. Arthur stepped closer to her as they watched Samson grab the struts of the vent and pull at them, before using his stun baton to pry it open fully. The sounds of the metal bending echoed around the long and empty hallway, and Julia felt this strange tension in the air, as it looked like the noise was sending shockwaves through those tiny black particles hanging in the air. They were moving almost like shadows every time Samson used his baton like a lever, and slowly but steadily pried the cover off the hole. The sight made Julia uneasy. Maybe they were organic in nature. Something alive? She could feel her hand trembling, looked over at Arthur, caught him chewing his lower lip. How long until the Artemis realized they had lost contact? She had no idea what had happened to the shuttle, if it had been blown up or just pushed away. But it should have sent out a distress call if it had noticed the danger. He just needed to hope that someone on the Artemis was keeping a close eye on them. With a last loud groan, Samson managed to pry the cover loose, and the heavy piece of metal sailed through the air, bumping into the ceiling before disappearing somewhere in the darkness ahead of them. She could see him smiling, raising a hand and giving them a thumbs up, but Julia hardly noticed the gesture. Her light was shining right into the vent, and what she saw in there was darkness. Not the same as before, out here in the hallway, but something black, glimmering like oil in the cone of her light. It wasn't flowing out, but since there was no gravity, that didn't mean anything. Samson turned his head as he noticed her lack of response, and she could see his shoulders grow stiff the next moment.
What is that?
She heard him ask. Julia had no answers. Even Arthur, standing next to her, looked completely bewildered. He could do nothing but stare in silence as Samson took the baton and prodded the black stuff inside the vent.
I don't know if that's a good idea.
She heard Arthur say, and nodded in agreement, but Samson had already touched the stuff.
It's sticky, but not totally liquid. I can't really explain it. It almost feels like some kind of sludge.
Julia could see tiny waves running through the dark stuff, and a sudden premonition hit her. This was all so strange. The floor, the flying dust in here, even the thing in the vents. It felt to her like they hadn't entered some abandoned ship, but a giant, living being. What if the whole thing were connected? If something had infected the ship and had spread out until it had taken over completely? It had been sleeping until they had docked and opened the door. That short moment of light had been this thing waking up for a second. Just a little reaction to being stung. Enough to swat away the mosquito. The dust in here wasn't dust, but something akin to blood. And the stuff running along the vents was the nerves. She heard Samson groan as he strained to pull out the baton again. Julia felt this ice-cold chill as she watched him. A scream was on her lips as she saw his thumb wandering toward the button of the baton. She wanted to warn him, but before she could, she saw the flash of light as he activated his weapon. And electricity coursed through the black mass inside the vents. The hallway was bathed in bright light as the whole ship shook, and Samson stumbled back. Inside the vent, the strange black sludge was thrashing around. Spikes formed in the liquid and fell back into waves before suddenly the doors along the hallway started to open on their own. A black cloud shot out of one of the rooms, rushed into the corridor, and flew toward them. Julia screamed as she noticed it, then felt a hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. Arthur. He was running, dragging her along. She looked back at Samson, who was still standing there, the baton in one hand and his other shot to his belt. The cloud was heading straight for him. They had to stay! Help him! Arthur was still dragging her along as she saw Samson pull one of the flashbangs from his belt, press its top to unlock it, then toss it straight at the cloud. It disappeared in a flying black mass before suddenly the cloud burst apart in a loud bang and flash of light. Julia heard this high-pitched ringing in her ears. She wanted to scream at Samson to follow, but the man wasn't moving. More black dust was already coming his way. He knew it, she realized. There was no getting out for him now. Whatever those black particles were, they were aiming for him and him alone. Julia looked at Arthur, who was running for the next door, then back and watched as Samson got surrounded by the cloud. There was a flash of light as his baton discharged, then a bellowing scream. Julia could see it in a gap that appeared in the cloud. The part of the suit on his left shoulder had holes in it, big ones. The black particles were tearing through, and Julia caught a glimpse of blood before Arthur pulled her along again, and she needed to look up ahead. Samson was dead. There was no escaping this thing. The light above was still on as Arthur almost dragged her to a small room that had opened, looked inside, then shoved her in before jumping in after her. Julia heard the second flashbang going off, but this time there was no scream coming through the radio. She looked around the small room that almost felt like a closet, then spotted Arthur standing by the door, his device already plugged into the socket, his fingers hammering away on the screen.
We need to hide!
She heard him hiss, almost out of breath. Julia shook her head. The door beeped, then fell shut, but not even a second later she could hear the hydraulic in there, already working to pull it apart again. She felt so cold. Her mind was racing. They had woken up this thing entirely. Those black particles were not blood. They were its defense system. The moment it had recognized Samson as someone dangerous, it had swarmed him. Julia could see the door open a bit, peered out and saw a cloud of black dust rushing through the hallway, then a part of it splitting up and heading toward them.
Shut the door!
Her own voice echoed around the small room. She could see Arthur's fingers flying over the screen, pressing buttons, and heard the door creaking. The small part of the cloud was coming toward them.
Now!
Julia begged. Then suddenly, the door crashed shut with a loud bang. Only a second before it sounded like sand was thrown at it. She heard a loud hiss coming from above, atop the door, then looked at Arthur and noticed the beads of sweat running down his face.
I bricked it.
He explained, a wavering smile forming around his lips.
You'd need to burn through this door to get in or out. No matter what happens, it can't be opened without force.
He had trapped them in here, but Julia didn't mind. She was sweating as well, shaking. That last moment when Samson had died still replayed in her mind. Those things ripping into the suit. At least they had found a room where no dust was flying through the air. But the light was still on. She looked down at the small screen on her wrist. Still over 80% of her oxygen remaining. Then why did it feel so stuffy in here? Julia grabbed the front of her mask and could see Arthur jumping up to his feet, stretching out his hand to stop her. She didn't care. In a single motion, she pulled off the mask and felt cold air on her skin for the first time since setting out in the shuttle. Arthur's eyes were wide, but Julia didn't care. She breathed in and smelled stale but fresh air. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, then deactivated her shoes so she would no longer be anchored to the floor.
What is going on in here?
Arthur asked, his voice still wavering. This was the end. She now knew.
We woke it up.
Julia answered, then turned her head. Without the helmet, she could hear it more clearly now. This scraping, scratching noise, like someone sanding metal. Julia closed her eyes again, kicked softly against the floor, and let herself drift up to the ceiling.
What do you mean we woke it up?
She could hear the shrill tone in his voice, but her smile remained steady.
Our shuttle was something like a mosquito. It stung the ship and we slipped inside. That time with the door? That was just a reflex. It wanted to rid itself of the pest, but didn't realize that we were already inside. Samson made it aware of us. That black sand? That's the immune system.
She could see him staring up at her, his eyes now narrowed.
You have lost your mind.
He replied, but Julia didn't answer. The scratching was getting louder. She opened her suit and pushed herself out of it, sending it into the corner while she held onto the ceiling.
The Artemis will send a second ship. They will come and get us.
Julia smiled at the misplaced hope.
It's awake now. Do you think this thing will let a second mosquito land on it?
She could see him rolling his eyes, but knew there was nothing left to say to him. He didn't believe her, but she knew deep inside that she was right. The ship's immune system had identified Samson as a threat, dealt with him, and was now looking for other such parasites. Now, the only question was if it was searching for humans, or just beings in the same kind of suit. She could see a vent above the door. The black, shimmering goo was in there as well. It knew where they were. She could hear the scratching outside getting even louder. It almost sounded like a drill.
You should get out of the suit if you want to live a bit longer,
Julia said, but her colleague didn't even listen to her. He was pacing back and forth down there. With his helmet, he couldn't hear them getting closer and closer.
You don't have much time.
He still didn't look up. Julia could see it and feel it. He was racking his brain for a way out. She raised her arm and looked at the small screen. Still no signal. And even if there had been, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. No ship would manage to dock here again. At least not until this thing fell asleep once more. Julia heard the metal groaning and pressed herself flat to the ceiling. This time, even Arthur had noticed. His eyes shot toward the door, then up to her. They were wide with terror. Julia held her breath. There was nothing she could do. The metal didn't screech or cry out. It wasn't pushed in or pried apart. All that happened was that a single hole appeared in the middle of the door. Arthur jumped as he saw it, but it was already far too late. Like gas, the black cloud shot into the room and enveloped her screaming crewmate. Julia could feel her heart almost beating out of control. Tiny black particles surrounded him in an instant. She heard his cry, the sound of his suit tearing, then a wet plop as the things burrowed into him. Drops of sweat were floating around her, up there by the ceiling. The wave of black things didn't stop. They continued rushing in, filling the room like water. She couldn't scream, didn't even dare to breathe. They were tearing Arthur apart. Julia felt herself almost losing consciousness. Her lungs had stopped breathing as Arthur was lifted up and torn to shreds. His blood was floating there in drops next to her sweat. She pressed her back against the ceiling and used her hands to hold herself as still as she could. Below her, the black mass spread out. She could feel it, this massive consciousness turning inward. Julia swallowed, then let out a breath. Something was staring back at her. Something big and ancient. It felt like 1,000,000 eyes had fallen on her. She closed her eyes and let out one final scream.